I watched my father's new wife plant drugs in my childhood bedroom, and that's when I knew she was trying to erase me from his life. But I didn't know yet that she already succeeded. The baggie was small, clear plastic, containing crushed white pills and a dusting of powder that caught the afternoon light streaming through my old window. She found it, or rather she found it, while I was downstairs having coffee with my father, discussing my graduate thesis on Faulkner. Her gasp of distress echoed through the brownstone, theatrical and perfectly timed. "Henry," she called down, her voice trembling with manufactured concern. "Henry, could you come up here for a moment?" I followed my father up the creaking stairs of our Brooklyn Heights brownstone, the same stairs I'd climbed thousands of times as a child, and watched as Isabella, beautiful 28-year-old Isabella, stood in my bedroom doorway, holding evidence of a problem I didn't have, performing grief over a crisis she'd invented. That's when I understood. This wasn't just about making me look bad. This was about erasing me entirely, about rewriting the story of our family with her as the protagonist and me as the cautionary tale, the damaged son who needed to be excised like a tumor. And the most terrifying part? My father, the legendary novelist Henry Thorne, the man who'd built his career on understanding the architecture of human deception, was already believing every word. To understand how completely she destroyed me, you need to understand what we had before she arrived. My father and I didn't just have a relationship. We had a language, a private dialect built over 24 years of shared grief, inside jokes, and an almost religious reverence for the written word. After my mother died when I was 8, it had been just the two of us in that sprawling, book-filled brownstone. Our home was less a house and more a library with bedrooms, every wall lined with first editions and literary classics, every surface covered with manuscripts and notebooks. Our ritual was sacred. Sunday chess in his study, the air thick with the scent of old paper, leather-bound books, and his pipe tobacco. The silence broken only by the clink of ivory on marble and the occasional murmured quote from Faulkner or Frost or Hemingway. He would teach me through the game, each move a lesson in strategy, in thinking 3 steps ahead, in understanding that the most powerful pieces often make the quietest moves. "Alex," he'd say, his weathered hand hovering over his knight, "the beauty of chess is that it's honest. Every piece moves according to its nature. There's no deception, no hidden agenda. Just logic, strategy, and consequence." I loved those Sundays more than anything in the world. Henry Thorne wasn't just my father, he was a literary giant. His novels explored the intricate architecture of the human heart with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. Critics called him the American conscience, a writer who could dissect moral complexity with surgical precision. He'd won every major award except the Nobel, and even that felt inevitable, just a matter of time. He was my compass, my confidant, my entire world. The day he introduced me to Isabella, our language began to die. It was a Saturday afternoon in September, unseasonably warm. I'd come home from Columbia for the weekend. My messenger bag, heavy with books for my graduate program in English literature. I was 24, working on my master's thesis, following in my father's footsteps in the only way I knew how. Through stories, through words, through the belief that literature could explain the inexplicable. I walked into the living room, and there she was, perched on the edge of our ancient sofa like an exotic bird that had mistakenly landed in a museum. "Alex," my father said. And there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, nervousness mixed with boyish excitement. "I'd like you to meet Isabella. We've been seeing each other for a few months now." She was breathtakingly beautiful. Raven black hair that fell in glossy waves past her shoulders, eyes the color of expensive whiskey, amber with flecks of gold, skin that seemed to glow from within, a smile that radiated warmth so intense it was almost blinding. She wore a silk dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, and when she stood to shake my hand, she moved with a dancer's grace. "Alex," she said, her voice like honey, her handshake firm but gentle. "I've heard so much about you. Your father talks about you constantly. The brilliant son following in his brilliant father's footsteps." She was 28 years old. My father was 60. Standing next to each other, they looked less like partners and more like a case study in May-December relationships, the kind my father had critiqued mercilessly in his novels, calling them exercises in mutual delusion. "She's an art curator," my father explained, unable to stop smiling at her. We met at a gallery opening. She was giving a lecture on the intersection of modernist literature and abstract expressionism. I tried. For my father's sake, I genuinely tried. I saw a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in years, a youthful infatuation that smoothed the weary lines around his eyes and made him look 10 years younger. If she made him happy, I would learn to love her. But from the very beginning, something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought I was being paranoid, jealous, the possessive son who couldn't handle his father finding happiness. It was in the way her warm eyes would turn cool and assessing when my father wasn't looking, like she was cataloging me, filing away information for future use. The way her questions about the family, about my mother, about the estate and the trust fund and the house were just a little too probing, too detailed, cloaked in disarming, innocent curiosity. "This house is incredible," she'd say, running her fingers along the spines of first editions worth tens of thousands of dollars. "Has it been in your family for generations?" "Just since my mother and I bought it 30 years ago," my father would answer, oblivious to the calculation in her eyes as she assessed its value. "And Alex, you have a trust fund from your mother's side?" she'd ask me over dinner, her smile sweet, her tone casual. "That must be such a comfort while you're in school." "It helps," I'd say carefully, watching her watch me. "How wonderful that you don't have to worry about money. You can just focus on your studies, on becoming a writer like your father." The words were kind, but there was something underneath them, something that felt like she was taking inventory of assets, calculating worth. The wedding was 3 months later. 3 months. From first meeting to marriage in 90 days. For a man who'd spent years writing a single paragraph, who'd courted my mother for 2 years before proposing. This whirlwind romance should have been a red flag the size of a stadium banner. But my father was in love, or what he thought was love. What I would later understand was loneliness wrapped in flattery and physical desire. The ceremony was small, elegant, held at the brownstone. 50 guests in the garden, string quartet playing Vivaldi, late October sunshine filtering through the changing leaves. I served as my father's best man, my heart a confusing tangle of happiness for him, and a profound, unsettling sense of loss. I'd lost my mother when I was 8. Now at 24, I felt like I was losing my father too. It was during the reception, as champagne flowed and guests mingled in the living room, that she made her first move. I was talking to my father's editor when Isabella appeared at my elbow, her face transformed into a mask of frantic distress. Her perfectly applied makeup was smudged, her eyes wide with panic. "Alex," she whispered urgently, her hand clutching my arm with surprising strength. "Thank God I found you. I can't find it. Your mother's locket. Henry gave it to me to wear today. It's gone." My blood ran cold. The locket was my father's most treasured possession, the one piece of my mother he'd kept with him always. A delicate gold oval that opened to reveal tiny photographs, my mother on one side, me as a baby on the other. He'd worn it on a chain around his neck for 16 years after she died, only removing it when he slept. Giving it to Isabella that morning had been a gesture of profound significance. a symbol of her acceptance into our family's narrative, into the sacred space my mother had occupied. "Are you sure?" I asked, setting down my champagne glass. "Where did you last see it?" "I was wearing it during the ceremony. I know I was, but now it's just gone." Her voice broke convincingly. "Oh God, Alex, your father will be devastated. That locket is everything to him." We searched everywhere. We retraced her steps from the bedroom where she'd gotten ready, through the garden where the ceremony had been held, back into the house. We enlisted the catering staff, guests, everyone. The search took on an increasingly desperate quality as the minutes stretched into an hour. Isabella grew more and more distraught, her performance of grief so convincing that even I started to feel sympathy through my suspicion. My father was a wreck, his face pale, his earlier joy turning to ash as he imagined losing that last connection to my mother. "It has to be here somewhere," he kept saying, his voice hollow. "It can't just disappear." It was my father who found it. I was in the hallway getting ready to leave, pulling on the tuxedo jacket I'd borrowed from his closet for the occasion. I didn't own one, had rented pants and a shirt. But the jacket was his. A classic Armani from the 80s that still fit perfectly. "Wait, son," he said, appearing beside me. His hand reached toward my jacket pocket, a strange expression crossing his face. "What's this?" His fingers emerged from the pocket, and dangling from them was the delicate gold chain of my mother's locket, catching the light. Irrefutable evidence. Time seemed to stop. How did that get there?" I stammered, staring at the locket like it was a snake that had appeared in my hand. "Dad, I swear to God, I didn't." Isabella, who had appeared silently behind my father like a ghost, put her hand to her mouth in a gesture of relieved shock. "Oh, Alex," she breathed, her voice dripping with sweet, forgiving concern. "You were helping me with my shawl earlier, remember? By the bar? It must have snagged on something and fallen into your pocket when you reached over. Don't worry for even a second, sweetheart. It was just a silly accident. These things happen." She smiled her brilliant, warm smile, stepped forward, and took the locket from my father's hand with tender care. She fastened it around her neck, her fingers brushing my father's cheek in a gesture of intimate reassurance. My father, relieved and exhausted from the emotional roller coaster, pulled me into a hug. "No harm done, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just glad we found it." But as he embraced me, I looked over his shoulder at his new wife. Our eyes met, and in those whiskey-colored eyes, just for a fraction of a second, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Calculation, triumph, satisfaction. It was the look of a chess player who just executed the opening move of a long game, the look of a storyteller who'd successfully planted the first crucial plot point. The narrative she was writing was called "Alex is careless," "Alex is untrustworthy," "Alex can't be relied upon." And my father, the master of fiction, the man who'd made his career understanding narrative structure and character motivation, was already her most captivated reader. That first act of sabotage was just the opening salvo in a war I didn't even know was being waged. Isabella's campaign to isolate and discredit me was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, a slow, insidious poisoning of the well of my father's love and trust. She was writing a novel in real time, with me as the tragic, flawed protagonist spiraling into ruin, and herself as the concerned, loving stepmother forced to witness my decline. Her methods were as brilliant as they were cruel. She never attacked me directly. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, she played the part of the worried family member, planting seeds of doubt so subtle my father didn't even realize they were growing until they'd become a forest of suspicion, blocking his view of who I really was. The drug plant in my bedroom came 2 months after the wedding. I'd come home for Thanksgiving weekend, looking forward to our traditional celebration, my father's terrible attempt at cooking a turkey, our ritual of reading passages from his works in progress, while we waited for the bird to burn, our evening chess game. Instead, I got an interrogation. "Alex, come into the study," my father said after dinner, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. Not anger, something worse. Disappointment mixed with fear. Isabella was already there, perched on the arm of his leather chair, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. On his desk sat the plastic baggie I'd seen her discover in my bedroom drawer. "Son," my father said, picking up the bag like it was contaminated. "Isabella found this while she was cleaning your room. She was putting away some fresh linens and it was in the back of your desk drawer." I stared at it, my mind wheeling. "Dad, I have absolutely no idea what that is. I've never seen it before in my life. I don't do drugs. You know I don't do drugs." "Of course you don't, sweetie," Isabella cooed, her voice syrupy with false compassion. She squeezed my father's shoulder gently. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe one of your friends from college left it there years ago, or maybe it's some kind of mistake. We shouldn't even be talking about it, really. I probably shouldn't have brought it up." But the seed was planted. The new chapter was titled, "Alex is Hiding Something." I fought back, of course. I insisted she had planted it. My denial, my anger at the accusation, was met with her calm, wounded tears and my father's troubled silence. "Alex," he said quietly, "your mother struggled with prescription medication after her cancer diagnosis. I watched her try to hide it from me, watched her make the same denials you're making now. I won't judge you, son, but I need you to be honest with me." "I am being honest." My voice rose, frustration and fear making me sound exactly like someone who was lying. "This is insane. She's manipulating you. Can't you see that?" Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Henry, maybe we should give Alex some space. He's clearly upset. We can talk about this another time." My father nodded, his face grave. "Go back to school, son. We'll discuss this when you've had time to think." I left that night, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, as I drove back to my apartment near Columbia. That's when I understood the full scope of what she was doing. She framed the narrative in a way that made my every move, my every word of protest, only served to prove her point. My truths sounded exactly like lies. My honest denials sounded like the desperate fabrications of an addict in denial. She was playing chess, and I hadn't even realized the game had started. Over the next 6 months, the attacks continued, each one more sophisticated than the last. Her next move was financial. She began planting stories about my desperation for money, my supposed reckless spending, my secret gambling debts, all complete fabrications, but delivered with such genuine concern that my father had no reason to doubt her. I was a graduate student living on a modest stipend, plus occasional disbursements from the trust fund my maternal grandmother had established. I lived frugally, buying used books, cooking my own meals, subletting a cramped studio in Morningside Heights. But Isabella painted a picture of a profligate lifestyle funded by addiction. He called yesterday asking about accessing more of the trust fund. She told my father over dinner one night when I wasn't there, her voice heavy with worry. He sounded so desperate, Henry. He kept talking about consolidating debts and needing money urgently. "I'm worried he owes money to dangerous people." I hadn't called. When I tried to point this out later, my father just sighed, a weary, disappointed sound that broke something in my chest. "Alex, your stepmother is just trying to help you. The first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem." "I don't have a problem. I don't have any debts. I didn't call asking for money." But my protests fell on deaf ears. My father was looking at me. but he was seeing the character Isabella had created, a desperate, deceitful addict who would say anything to avoid accountability. The Sunday chess games stopped. Our long, rambling conversations about literature and life were replaced by his strained, awkward questions about my health and stress levels. The comfortable, easy language we'd once shared, the private dialect of inside jokes and literary references and comfortable silences, was gone, replaced by a painful vocabulary of suspicion and disappointment. He stopped returning my calls as frequently, stopped asking about my thesis, stopped being my father, and became instead the wary guardian of a problem child he'd created in his imagination. I was being erased from my own life, and the man who'd taught me that truth was sacred was helping to write me out of existence. The final brutal act came on my 25th birthday. I arrived at the brownstone expecting a quiet dinner, maybe a return to normalcy, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Instead, I walked into an ambush. My father sat in his leather armchair in the living room, his face etched with a grief so profound it looked like he was attending a funeral. Isabella sat on the armrest beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her face a perfect portrait of sorrowful support. Across from them on the sofa sat a stern-looking woman with close-cropped gray hair, rimless glasses, and a clipboard. She wore a blazer with a pin that read Certified Interventionist. "Alex, son, please sit down," my father said, his voice heavy, broken. "This is Dr. Helen Miller. She specializes in helping families deal with addiction." The world tilted sickeningly on its axis. An intervention. They were staging an intervention for a problem that didn't exist. This was it, the climax of Isabella's story, the scene she'd been building toward for 9 months. For the next hour, I sat frozen while they subjected me to a surreal, Kafkaesque trial. My father read from a prepared list of my supposed transgressions, a list I could tell had been carefully curated by Isabella. He spoke of my erratic behavior, my financial desperation, my secretive habits, his voice shaking with emotion. Isabella chimed in periodically, her voice soft and pained, adding fabricated anecdotes. The time she'd supposedly found me glassy-eyed and incoherent after a holiday dinner. The shady-looking friend she'd seen me with outside the brownstone. The mysterious phone calls she claimed to have overheard where I was clearly talking to a dealer. Every single word was a lie, but they were delivered with such conviction, such apparent anguish, that even I started to doubt my own memory. "This is classic addict behavior," Dr. Miller intoned, her clinical gaze dissecting me like I was a specimen under glass. The lying, the manipulation, and refusal to accept responsibility, the anger at people who are just trying to help. Every protest I made, every attempt to inject reality into this fiction, was expertly dismissed as denial and defensiveness. I was being gaslit with surgical, systematic precision. I looked at my father, this man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to value truth above all else, and his eyes were pleading with me to confess to sins I'd never committed. In that moment, I realized I'd already lost. Isabella hadn't just turned him against me. She'd replaced me, in his mind, with a fictional character he now believed in more than he believed in his own son. "We've made arrangements," my father said, his voice a dead monotone, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "For a 90-day residential treatment program upstate. We'll pay for everything, but until you agree to go, until you agree to get help." His voice broke. "I can't be part of your life, Alex. I can't enable your destruction." He slid a bank statement across the coffee table. My trust fund account. The one my mother had set up for me before she died. "I've frozen your access," he said, each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would drown me. "Your credit cards will be canceled tomorrow morning. and you're not welcome in this house until you agree to treatment." He stood up, walked over to me, placed both hands on my shoulders. I could smell his familiar scent, pipe tobacco, and old books, and the lavender soap he'd used my entire life. "This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "But I'm doing it because I love you, because I can't watch you die." Isabella was openly weeping now, a beautiful tragic heroine in the final act of my destruction. She'd won. Her story was complete. And I had been written out of existence, erased from my own life by a woman who'd known me less than a year. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my mind a storm of rage and grief and disbelief. I looked at my father one last time, this stranger who wore his face, who'd abandoned reason and critical thinking and everything he'd taught me. And I saw no flicker of doubt, no trace of the man who'd taught me to question every narrative. He'd made his choice. He'd chosen the beautiful fiction over the difficult truth. I walked out of the brownstone I'd grown up in, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me with a sound of absolute finality. I was officially homeless, penniless, and in the eyes of the only family I had, a drug addict who'd refused help. Isabella had won, or so I thought. The weeks after my excommunication were a free fall into a new, terrifying reality that I'd only read about in novels, never imagined I'd experience firsthand. The first casualty was my apartment. Without access to my trust fund, I couldn't make rent. The $800 a month I earned as a teaching assistant barely covered food, let alone housing in Manhattan. I packed my life, my books, my clothes, my laptop, my mother's few possessions I'd kept, into cardboard boxes and put them in a storage unit in Queens, a tiny 10 by 10 mausoleum for the life I used to have. I felt like I was attending my own funeral, loading box after box of my former existence into a concrete cell that smelled of mildew and strangers' forgotten belongings. My credit cards stopped working, one by one, each declined transaction, a small, fresh humiliation. At the bodega where I bought coffee every morning, my card was declined for a $2.50 purchase. The cashier's pitying look felt like a slap. I was forced to sell anything of value just to survive. My laptop went first, a MacBook Pro I'd saved for months to buy, sold to a pawn shop in Chinatown for a fraction of its worth. My watch, a gift from my father for my 21st birthday, a vintage Omega that had belonged to his father, gone. My mother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry of hers I'd kept, gone. Each sale felt like amputating another piece of myself. I found a room for rent in a crumbling apartment in Far Rockaway, about as far from Brooklyn Heights as you could get while still being in New York City. $400 a month for a space barely larger than a closet, with peeling paint, a window that looked onto a brick wall 6 inches away, and a door that didn't lock properly. The building smelled of boiled cabbage and despair and things I tried not to identify. I, Alex Thorne, son of a literary icon, raised surrounded by first editions and intellectual discourse, was now sleeping on a stained mattress that smelled of previous tenants' shattered dreams. To survive, I took a job at a 24-hour diner in Queens, washing dishes on the graveyard shift. The work was brutal, mind-numbing and scalding. I would stand for 8 hours, midnight to 8 a.m., my hands raw and red from the hot water and harsh industrial soap. The roar of the commercial dishwasher, a deafening soundtrack to my downfall. I'd watch the late-night clientele through the kitchen window, the drunks sobering up over coffee, the lonely eating eggs at 3 a.m., the lost souls who couldn't sleep, and feel a terrifying sense of kinship. This was my tribe now. The physical exhaustion was almost welcome. It meant I could sleep during the day, could shut off the tart of my brain that screamed about the injustice of it all. But the nights were endless. The grief was the hardest part. It was a constant, crushing weight in my chest, a sense of amputation. I hadn't just lost my home and my financial security. I'd lost my father. I'd lost the one person who was supposed to know me better than anyone, who was supposed to believe in me unconditionally. And he'd chosen her instead. I would scroll through his social media during my breaks at the diner, a masochistic ritual of psych torture I couldn't stop. I'd see pictures of him and Isabella at glamorous literary events, at book parties, on trips to Paris and Rome and Barcelona. They looked happy, unburdened, living a beautiful life built on the wreckage of mine. He'd successfully excised the cancerous son from his life, and the surgery had apparently cured him. One particularly brutal night, after a 12-hour shift covering for a coworker, I sat in my cramped room at 4 a.m. The city's symphony of sirens and garbage trucks outside my window. I pulled out my phone and saw a new photo my father had posted on Instagram. It was him and Isabella in his study, sitting at the chessboard, my chessboard, the one where I'd learned strategy and patience and how to think 3 steps ahead. She was laughing, her head on his shoulder, her hand moving a piece. The caption read, "Teaching my brilliant wife the game of kings. Finally found a worthy opponent." Something inside me, something that had been weeping for months, suddenly went silent. The grief, the hurt, the self-pity, it all collapsed inward and was compressed by the sheer, unbearable pressure of injustice into something new. Something hard and cold and sharp. Rage. Pure, clean, methodical rage that burned away the tears and left behind a terrifying clarity. I'd been trying to fight her fiction with my truth. I'd been pleading my case to a judge who was in love with the prosecution. It was a fool's game. My father, the novelist, had taught me that the most powerful story always wins, regardless of the facts. Isabella was a master storyteller. To be her, I couldn't just debunk her narrative. I had to write a better one, a truer one. I had to expose her in a way that was so public, so undeniable, that even my father couldn't write it away. I stood up and walked to the rickety desk in the corner of my room. I opened my laptop, a used ThinkPad I'd bought for $200, a dinosaur compared to what I'd had before. I wouldn't be the victim in her story anymore. I would be the author of hers. Using the research skills my father had drilled into me since childhood. How to dig, how to cross-reference, how to find the hidden truths between the lines. I began to investigate the woman known as Isabella. I didn't know what I was looking for. A lie on her resume, a disgruntled ex, a criminal record, anything. But I was going to find it. My new life's work wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It was about finding the truth, and then using that truth to burn her world to the ground. My investigation became my obsession, my purpose, the single burning star in the dark sky of my demolished life. I started with the basics, the public-facing narrative she'd constructed so carefully. According to her, she had a prestigious degree in art history from a small, exclusive university in Switzerland. She'd worked as a curator for a private gallery in Milan. Her parents had died in a tragic boating accident when she was 19, leaving her orphaned and alone in the world. It was romantic, sympathetic, perfectly calibrated to appeal to my father's novelist's love of tragic backstories. It was also completely fabricated. The Swiss university had no record of an Isabella Rossi in their alumni database. The private gallery in Milan didn't exist. The address she listed led to a pizzeria. The boating accident had no public record anywhere in Italy, despite the fact that such tragedies are always documented. She was a ghost, a beautiful fiction. But ghosts leave traces if you know where to look. I spent my days sleeping in fitful bursts, and my nights at the diner, and every spare moment hunting through digital archives, social media, public records. I lived on instant ramen and black coffee. My world narrowed to the glowing screen of my laptop. The first real crack came from deep diving into old society photos from Palm Beach, cross-referencing faces and names. I found a group photo from a charity gala 5 years ago. There she was, younger, with different blonder hair, but unmistakably her. The caption tagged her as Sophia Rossi. Sophia Rossi, not Isabella. That name was the key that unlocked everything. I used the last of my savings, the crumpled bills I'd been hoarding under my mattress, to hire a private investigator. His name was Jack Costello, a former NYPD detective who'd gone private. A gruff, cynical man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too much. "You got a photo and a name?" he asked when we met at a diner in Queens. I showed him everything I'd found. The Palm Beach photo, the name Sophia Rossi, the timeline of her appearance in my father's life. "Give me a week," he said. 7 days later, Costello's report landed in my encrypted email inbox. Reading it felt like staring into an abyss that was staring back. Sophia Rossi was a professional con artist, a predator who moved through the world of wealthy, lonely men like a shark through blood-warm water. She wasn't an orphan. Her parents were alive and well, living in Coral Gables, Florida, and had disowned her 3 years ago after she'd stolen $50,000 from them to pay gambling debts. She had a string of former relationships, with wealthy older men stretching back over a decade. Each relationship followed the same pattern: whirlwind romance, quick marriage or engagement, systematic isolation of the mark from family and friends, then a sudden disappearance, with maxed-out credit cards, drained bank accounts, and forged signatures on loan documents. There were allegations, settlements, non-disclosure agreements with 3 different men who'd been too embarrassed to press charges. And most damningly, there was a mountain of current debt. Online gambling sites, high-interest loans from predatory lenders, maxed-out credit cards under various aliases. Her entire life was an elaborate performance designed to fund a voracious gambling addiction. The irony was so bitter it actually made me laugh out loud in my cramped room at 3 a.m. She painted me as an addict to hide the fact that she was one. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. Simply presenting this to my father would be useless. She would spin it as lies from a desperate, vindictive son. Further proof of my supposed drug-fueled paranoia. She'd cry, she'd play the victim, and my father would comfort her and hate me more. I needed to catch her in the act. I needed to create a situation where her true nature would be revealed publicly, undeniably, in a way that even my father couldn't rationalize away. And I knew exactly when to do it. The launch party for my father's new novel, The House of Echoes. It was scheduled for 3 months away, set to be the literary event of the season. The book was his magnum opus, a sprawling family saga about secrets and lies and the price of self-deception. The irony of that was not lost on me. The party would be massive. The entire New York literary world would attend. Critics, agents, publishers, journalists. It would be public, prestigious, and absolutely perfect for her public destruction. I spent those 3 months building an elaborate trap. With Costello's help, I created a fictional persona, a wealth management consultant representing a deceased distant relative of one of the men Sophia had conned in Florida. This fictional relative had supposedly died recently, and overwhelmed with guilt about how Sophia had been treated, had left her a significant inheritance. A portfolio of rare bearer bonds worth $3 million. It was a classic advance fee scam, the kind of con used to catch con artists. The bonds had to be transferred in person due to their untraceable nature. All Sophia had to do was bring a good faith deposit of $20,000 in cash to cover legal fees. We knew about her gambling debts. We knew she was desperate. We knew she wouldn't be able to resist. Costello made contact through a discreet email. Mentioning mutual acquaintances from her Palm Beach days, he suggested a brief meeting during the book launch, a place so public it would seem perfectly safe. While Costello set the financial trap, I worked on the narrative exposure. I created an anonymous blog called The Abandoned Son, posting carefully detailed stories about a young man whose father had been stolen by a con artist. I never used my name, but anyone in our literary circle would recognize the details. Then I fed everything: the blog, the evidence of Sophia's past cons, the documentation of her deaths, to Brian Finch, a notorious literary gossip columnist who loved scandal more than literature. I timed it perfectly. I told Finch that the final, explosive proof of Isabella's true identity would be revealed on the night of Henry Thorne's book launch. The trap was set. The story was written. All I had to do was watch her walk into it. The night of the book launch was cold and clear, early December, the kind of night where your breath creates clouds and the city looks almost magical under the lights. The event was held at a soaring gallery space in Soho, all exposed brick and dramatic lighting. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the literary elite mingling. Agents in designer suits, authors I'd studied in grad school, critics whose reviews could make or break careers. I didn't go inside. I stood across the street, hidden in the shadow of a darkened doorway, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My father arrived in a town car, looking every bit the distinguished author in a tailored jacket, his silver hair perfectly styled. And on his arm was Isabella, Sophia, stunning in an emerald gown that probably cost more than I'd earned in 6 months at the diner. She was radiant, playing the role of supportive wife to perfection, smiling and charming everyone she met, and in her designer clutch was $20,000 in cash, money I knew she'd stolen from my father's account, ready to complete a deal that would destroy her. My phone buzzed. A text from Costello. "She's here. She's hooked." I sent the final email to Brian Finch, the subject line, "The truth about Henry Thorne's wife." The email contained everything: her real name, the names of her victims, the settlements, the gambling debts, the photo comparisons, everything. At exactly 9:15, just as my father took the stage to read from his new novel, I gave Costello the signal. I watched through the window as he intercepted Isabella near the back of the room. I saw them talking, saw her reach into her clutch. Then everything happened at once. My phone started vibrating with alerts. Finch's article had gone live. The House of Lies. Henry Thorne's new novel becomes life imitating art as wife Isabella, exposed as serial con artist Sophia Rossi. Inside, phones started lighting up across the room like fireflies. The story was spreading. At that exact moment, a process server I'd hired entered the room, walking directly to Isabella with a legal envelope. "Sophia Rossi?" he asked, loud enough to cut through the growing murmur. "My name is Isabella Thorne," she hissed. "Close enough," he said, and handed her the envelope. "You've been served." The envelope of cash fell from her nerveless fingers, scattering $100 bills across the polished floor. On stage, my father stopped reading mid-sentence. Isabella's phone buzzed incessantly in her hand, the screen alight with notifications. Her carefully constructed world was shattering in real time, in front of everyone. She looked up, her eyes wild with panic, scanning the darkness outside the window, as if she could feel me watching. Then she turned and fled, pushing through the crowd and out a side exit. I stayed in the shadows, a ghost observing the destruction of the woman who'd tried to erase me. It was done. An hour later, I used my old key, the one she'd never known about, to let myself into the brownstone. I found my father in his study, sitting in his leather chair, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The chessboard sat between us, pieces set up for a game that would never be played. He looked up as I entered, and his face crumpled. "Alex," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. I sat down in my old chair across from him. We sat in silence for a long time. "She's gone," he finally said. "Vanished. Her lawyer called. Confirmed everything in that article. Everything." More silence, the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. "I have to ask you something," I said quietly. "Did part of you know, all along?" He stared at the chessboard for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with self-loathing. "A story doesn't have to be true to be good. That's what I always taught you." He looked up at me, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Her story, it was a good one. It was the one I wanted to believe. I was lonely, Alex, so goddamn lonely. Afraid of being an old man with nothing but his books. She made me feel like the hero of a great romance." He took a shuddering breath. "I knew there were plot holes, but I chose to ignore them, and in doing so, I let her make you the villain." His voice broke. "Can you ever forgive me for that?" I sat there, looking at my father, this brilliant man reduced to rubble by his own willful blindness, and felt something shift inside me. The rage was gone. In its place was something more complex. Pity mixed with love, mixed with a grief that would take years to process. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But we can start." I reached out and moved my king's pawn forward 2 squares. The opening move, a new game, a new story we would have to write together, one painful, honest line at a time. And as we sat there in the dusty study filled with books and memories, the silence between us was no longer an absence. It was a space waiting to be filled with the difficult, beautiful, and true words we had almost lost forever.